Hi, today I want to talk about the confusing world of food sensitivity tests. I feel like this is something that comes up often in my work of people who are maybe dealing with some IBS-like symptoms or having some other type of distress and feel like it's food related and really want to turn to food sensitivity tests to determine if there is something at play. But this is kind of a confusing and nuanced world. So I want to talk a little bit more about it and answer some questions about what food sensitivity tests can define for you and what they're not capable of just yet. So let's first dive into the often confusing world of these tests, how to interpret the results, and crucially, distinguish the difference between a true allergy and a sensitivity, because those two things are different. It's important to also understand the limitations of these tests before we talk about cutting anything out of your diet. So, just because you do a food sensitivity test and it comes back positive with certain things, it's important to really understand the limitations and what those positives might mean before we move forward with completely eliminating all of those things. So, I want to start with clarifying a common point of confusion, which is the difference between a food allergy and a food sensitivity. These are two very different things. So, a food allergy is an immune system reaction that can be severe and even life-threatening. I want you to think things like peanuts, shellfish, or eggs. These are really common food allergy foods. And when you have a food allergy, your immune system produces this thing called IgE. It's an antibody in our bodies. And these reactions are usually pretty immediate and they can involve symptoms like hives, swelling, difficulty breathing, or even anaphylaxis, which is why these can be life-threatening. Diagnosing a food allergy typically involves a skin prick test or a blood test that measures these IgE antibodies that are present. And these are highly reliable tests because we are measuring the specific IgE antibody that is being sent out in direct response to the specific food that you have an allergy to. Now, a food sensitivity sometimes is referred to as a food intolerance, and this is a different beast entirely. It involves often less severe symptoms. It can also often be a delayed reaction, and it does not involve that IgE antibody that is found in food allergies. Instead, the symptoms that you usually feel with a food sensitivity are more things like digestive issues, so something like gas, bloating, diarrhea, or constipation. It can also include things like headaches, fatigue, and skin problems. So there is some overlap in these that a food allergy can create things like hives, a food sensitivity can still show up in the skin. Um, and so that's where sometimes there is some trickiness to teasing these out. These reactions, though, with food sensitivities are usually dose dependent, meaning a small amount might be fine, but a larger amount can typically cause symptoms. So, lactose intolerance is a very classical example where people can have small amounts of dairy and they're totally fine. But if they were to have an entire bowl of ice cream, now this becomes a very different story. So, knowing the difference between these two things, let's talk about where food sensitivity tests do come in. The most common type of food sensitivity test that you'll encounter is the IgG antibody test. So, food allergies are testing IgE, food sensitivities are commonly testing IgG. This test measures the level of immunoglobulin G. It's another antibody that's in the blood, and it does react to various food proteins. The idea is that elevated IgG levels might indicate an immune response to a specific food, which would then suggest a sensitivity. You'll typically get a report that lists a wide range of a variety of foods, often categorizing them as high reactivity, moderate reactivity, and low or no reactivity. But here's where the interpretation gets a little tricky. It's critical to understand the scientific consensus. While IgG tests are widely available, their reliability and clinical utility for diagnosing food sensitivities are really highly debated in the medical community. So while IgE testing is accepted as a good method for testing for food allergies and is pretty reliable, the IgG testing is still kind of up for debate within the medical community and the bodies of research that are out there. So let's talk about kind of the degree of error that exists and the limitations associated with these IgG tests that we typically use for food sensitivities. IgG as a marker of exposure um, really shows us when we've been exposed to a food. It does not necessarily mean that we have an intolerance. So many experts argue that elevated IgG antibodies are simply a normal immune response to an exposure to food. So if I eat a lot of gluten, I am being exposed to gluten. I may have more of an IgG response when I have gluten in my system, because it has to do with exposure, not necessarily intolerance. So, this is a sign that your immune system has encountered that food, not necessarily that it's reacting negatively to it. So, kind of think of this like a memory. Your body remembers that food, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily causing the problem. There's also somewhat of a lack of strong scientific evidence when it comes to IgG testing. Unlike IgE testing for allergies, there is a lack of robust peer-reviewed scientific studies demonstrating a direct link between elevated IgG levels and a specific food sensitivity symptom. Many studies have failed to show that eliminating IgG reactive foods necessarily improve symptoms more so than a placebo. It's also common to get some false positives with this testing because IgG can simply indicate exposure. So you might see high reactivity to foods that you eat often and have no issues with. So that's my example of gluten. If I'm eating a lot of wheat and a lot of gluten containing products, I might see a high reactivity because I have had exposure, but I might not necessarily have any issues with digesting or managing gluten within my body. This can lead to some unnecessary and restrictive dietary changes. I see this a lot with individuals who do this type of testing, and they get this whole list back and they say, oh my gosh, I can't eat anything on here. And so their diet does become pretty restrictive. And that can potentially lead to some other issues, such as nutritional deficiencies. If we're cutting out entire food groups or a lot of variety, that can have an impact on our overall nutritional quality of our diet. So imagine cutting out staples like eggs or wheat, things that you would eat every single day because a test shows high IgG, even though they may not be the reason that you're experiencing symptoms. The other thing to keep in mind is that IgG levels can fluctuate. So your IgG levels can change based on your diet, if you've had any recent infections, and even your gut health. A high reading 1 month might be different the next time, making it difficult to pinpoint the consistent issue. So I might go in and have a food sensitivity test done and find out that I am highly reactive to, let's say, gluten again. But then I might go get that testing done 6 months later, and those IgG levels might have fluctuated if I'm eating less gluten in that 6 month period, or if I've had a recent illness or something else go on, that those test results might show that now my gluten is low reactivity. So which one is it? Which one can we trust? The other point I want to make about this IgG testing is that it is not a diagnostic tool for true allergies. So it is really vital to remember that IgG tests cannot diagnose a true food allergy. So if you are someone who suspects that you have a true food allergy, like to, let's say, eggs, and you have an anaphylactic response when you eat eggs, that is an allergy. You need to consult an allergist and get that IgE test. An IgG food sensitivity test will not be adequate to get that diagnosis for you. Okay, so we've kind of talked about like some of the flaws within IgG testing. So you might be asking yourself, if that's the case and these tests have all these limitations, how should we interpret these results and what truly might be an allergy versus a sensitivity? So let's kind of talk through how we can use these results, because just because something is flawed doesn't mean that we can't still use it as a tool to be helpful as we're going through figuring out triggers and understanding our gut microbiome better. So first and foremost, do not self-diagnose or make any drastic dietary changes based solely on an IgG test result. As we just discussed, there's a lot of variability. There are a lot of things at play. So if you are getting one of these tests done, don't just automatically like throw everything out and start from scratch, self-diagnose, and have an extremely restrictive diet. We should take a slightly more reasonable and responsible approach to that. So, first, I would recommend prioritizing your critical symptoms. So, the most important indicator of a food sensitivity are your actual symptoms. If you consistently experience digestive upset, headaches, or other issues after eating a specific food, that is going to be your strongest clue, regardless of what an IgG test says. So, your IgG test might say that dairy is a moderate for you, but you notice that every single time you have dairy, you feel gassy and bloated and immediately have to run to the bathroom. Pay attention to those symptoms. Those are going to be your most important indicators of what is going on in your body. I also recommend consulting with a healthcare professional. Before considering any dietary changes, talk with your doctor or a registered dietitian because they can help guide you through these changes that you're looking to make. They can also help with interpreting your symptoms, and if appropriate, they can help you with an elimination diet. I do this with a lot of clients that I work with that experience IBS type symptoms. And so we will work through elimination diets to really identify all of those individual triggers that are impacting them. When we talk about elimination diets, they really are the gold standard for looking at these food sensitivities. So, this is still considered the most reliable way to identify food sensitivities, not necessarily the testing. It doesn't mean that we can't use the testing in conjunction, but an elimination diet is a really good way to isolate specific items to determine how they're impacting your gut specifically. So, these elimination diets typically involve removing suspected foods from your diet for a period of time, typically 2 to 4 weeks, and then reintroducing them one at a time and carefully observing the symptoms as you reintroduce each item. This process is typically done under the guidance of a professional, so a dietitian like myself or a medical doctor would be able to help with this elimination diet. And we want to make sure that we're really paying attention to the connection that specific foods have with your body's reaction. If you feel significantly better when a food is removed and symptoms return when we reintroduce it, that is going to be a strong indication of a sensitivity. So once again, there's some like other diagnostic ways that we can look at the way that your body is reacting rather than just using the information from those IgG tests. You might be thinking, okay, that's great. Elimination diet, maybe that's something I need to do, but I already have an IgG test. So if you already have done an IgG test and you have those results, you can absolutely discuss those results with your healthcare provider that you're working alongside. And they might use this as one piece of information to consider for an elimination diet, particularly if you have a lot of suspected foods. However, I want to once again emphasize that this is not a definitive diagnostic tool. So this is actually a technique that I use with a lot of my clients. I have a lot of clients who have gone and done food sensitivity testing. They've gotten these IgG results back and are still experiencing symptoms. So we will often use that test result to help guide what foods we're going to reintroduce first and kind of the order in which we're going to do things. So they can be really helpful in helping that healthcare professional that you're working with to give you a little bit more tailored guidance as you go through that elimination phase. I also want to make a note that true allergies do require professional diagnosis. So if you experience immediate or severe reactions to food, even in a tiny amount, or if you suspect an IgE mediated allergy, you should see an allergist for proper testing and management. And these tests are really highly accurate. They are used consistently and well respected within the field. So if that is you and you really truly believe that you have an allergy at play, instead of going the elimination diet route and seeing a dietitian for that, you should really be reaching out to an allergist. So, kind of to like wrap this topic up, food sensitivity testing, particularly the IgG form of testing, is a really complex area with a lot of misinformation that's surrounding it. And while the idea of a simple blood test identifying all of your food triggers is really appealing, the scientific evidence is still kind of muddy on how we feel about it. Your body's symptoms are going to be your most valuable guide. This doesn't mean that we can't go get a test done and that those results can't be used to help guide that, but we really need to pay attention to what symptoms you're feeling and when they start to get better or worse, depending on what you have or have removed from your diet. So, combined with the expertise of your healthcare professional, that systematic approach, like the elimination diet I've been talking about, can truly decode your digestion and help to identify what foods might be contributing to that discomfort. And some of those foods might be on that IgG food sensitivity list as being marked as a high sensitivity. Other things that might be marked as a high sensitivity, we might test in that elimination diet and find that it doesn't have any impact on your symptoms. So that would be an example of where you might get a whole list of things back saying that you are highly reactive to these foods. But once we actually go through the elimination diet and test it, we might find out that you don't need to eliminate 90% of them. It's just this 10% that seem to be having an impact. So I want you to remember to really work on eating healthy and nourishing your body and paying attention to those cues that your body is giving you. If you are someone who is struggling with digestive issues or interested in sensitivity testing or allergy testing, we dietitians at eNRG Performance are so happy to talk to you and help guide you through that process. We are also, like I mentioned, so happy to work with someone who already has a food sensitivity test done, but is still experiencing symptoms. We can absolutely use that information to help guide that elimination diet that we would likely take you through. So I hope this clears up a little bit of misinformation about food sensitivities versus food allergies. And if you are someone who is struggling in this specific area, please do not be afraid to reach out. We would love to help you on your journey.